The saloon was a powder keg of whiskey and smoke. Laughter scraped against the walls as cards hit wood, and Boots stomped a ragged beat to a fiddle that sounded like a dying cat. But then the door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The noise didn't stop. It changed. It twisted into something sharp, something hungry. Every single eye in that place locked onto the stranger in the plain dress, the girl clutching a faded shawl like it was the only thing holding her together. She froze in the doorway, trembling, the fabric a pathetic shield against 100 glares. Then she forced one foot in front of the other, her shoes making a soft, scared sound on the grimy floorboards. "Please," she whispered, a sound swallowed by the den. "I need work. Any work. I can scrub floors, wash dishes." A cannon blast of laughter cut her off. It was cruel and hot. A man at the table closest to her leaned back, his eyes glinting under the brim of his hat, a grin spreading across his face like a stain. "Work?" he jeered, his voice dripping with scorn. "This ain't a charity house. Best a girl like you can do is find a man's lap to keep warm." His hand shot out like a snake. It wasn't her he grabbed, it was the shawl. He tugged, pulling her off balance, and the whole room roared, a wave of boots and hoots crashing over her. She gasped, stumbling back, tears instantly flooding her eyes. "Don't touch me," she cried, her voice a thin, tearing sound in the thick air. For a second, the laughter only got louder. Mugs were raised, boots stomped harder. They were feeding on her fear. And then a different sound cut through it all. The heavy thud of boots coming across the floor. Deliberate, unstoppable. From a dark corner, the rancher had risen. His broad shoulders parted the smoke like a ship's prow through water. He strode forward, his hat tipped back just enough to show eyes that burned with a cold fire. The man still had his hand on her shawl, his smirk wide. But that smirk started to die when the rancher's shadow fell over him. The rancher didn't say a word. He just reached out, his hand closing around the drunk's wrist. The man's bones must have screamed. The rancher forced the hand down with the kind of strength that comes from the earth itself. The saloon went dead silent. His voice was low, but it hit every corner of that room. "Stand behind me." The words weren't a request. They were a command. They hit the saloon like a gunshot, and everything froze. The fiddle went silent. Muggs stopped halfway to mouse. Every head turned. She stared up at him, her breath locked in her chest, tears hanging on her lashes. The warmth of his back was a sudden wall between her and the whole world. He was a shield against 100 hungry eyes. Whispers started to ripple through the silence. Disbelief. Mockery. The rancher? Shielding that trash? Someone scoffed from the bar. "He's gone soft." But other whispers were different. Eyes darted from her torn shawl to the man who stood tall and unshaken, as if he were carved from the mountain itself. The drunk snarled, yanking his hand free. But the rancher didn't even flinch. He just shifted his stance, planting himself more firmly in front of her. His gaze swept the crowd, and his voice was steady as a rock. "She asked for work," he said. "You'll give her respect." The silence that followed was so sharp you could cut yourself on it. The fiddler let his bow drop with a clatter. The only sound left was the ragged, terrified hiss of her own breath. She clutched her shawl, shame and fear warring inside her. But now there was something else. A tiny anchor in a storm. A promise in the words that still echoed off the walls. "Stand behind me." For the first time since she'd walked into the dust-choked streets of a town called Dustin, she wasn't completely alone. But she could still feel their eyes burning into her. The ridicule wasn't gone. It was just waiting, biding its time. And in the shadow of his impossible strength, she had to wonder. Could one man's vow, spoken in a whisper, really stand against the weight of a whole town's laughter? The silence in the saloon held for a heartbeat, and then it cracked wide open. Laughter poured back into the room like a flash flood, angrier this time, sharper. "Respect?" A man barked from a corner table, his voice thick and slurring. "She don't look worth a damn button, let alone respect." Another man slammed his hand on the bar, his grin a slash of yellow teeth. "Red Fern's gone mad, fighting off dogs for a scrap of meat." The words were like stones thrown one after another. The men who had been quiet before now leaned forward, their eyes hungry. This was a show now, a spectacle of a good man's foolish pride. She clutched her shawl tighter, her face burning. Their eyes felt like they were crawling on her skin, their sneers digging into her deeper than any hand ever could. But the rancher didn't move. His stance was broad, steady. His body was still a living shield between her and the pack. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his silence was heavier than all their jeers combined. Slowly, reluctantly, the laughter began to falter again. That's when Vernon Hale stood up. He was a man with a jawline as cruel as a blade and a thirst for starting fires just to watch things burn. He rose from his chair in the back, and his voice dripped with pure venom. "Stand behind you, eh, Red Fern?" he drawled, his eyes sliding over her, making her feel stripped bare. "You really think a plain-faced girl with nothing but rags on her back deserves the protection of a man like you? You shame yourself. You shame this whole town." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some men still hung back, but others nodded, their cruelty validated by a leader. She shrank under the force of his glare, her shawl clenched so tight the threads cut into her palms. "I only asked for work," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard it barely made a sound. Hale laughed, a sharp, ugly crack of a sound. "Work?" he spat. "Dustin don't need beggars. We need women who can offer more than dishwater and tears." The saloon erupted again. Boots stomped, mugs clattered. She felt her knees start to buckle, the last of her strength draining away. But then the rancher's hand found her arm. It was firm, steady, and warm. And when he spoke, his voice was pure iron. "She asked for work," he said, his eyes never leaving Hale. "Not your hands, not your scorn. If that shames you, Hale, it speaks a whole lot louder about you than it does about her." Gasps stirred in the smoke. A few men actually nodded, caught off guard by the simple truth of it. Others just scowled deeper. Hale's eyes narrowed to slits. Fury sparked in their depths. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own den, in front of everyone. "You'll regret standing for her," he hissed, his lip curling back from his teeth. "This saloon eats the weak, Red Fern, and she's the weakest thing I've ever seen." He moved fast as a snake striking. He reached for the shawl again, the one shielding her chest. But this time the rancher's hand was faster. He caught Hale's wrist in midair, twisting it so hard that Hale cried out, a strangled hiss of pain, and staggered back. The crowd roared, some in shock, some in pure, bloodthirsty delight at the clash of pride and strength. "Touch her again," the rancher said, his voice a low thunder that promised violence, "and you'll answer to me." The threat hung in the air, sharp and deadly. For a long moment, nobody dared to breathe. Hale ripped his hand free, cradling his bruised wrist, his face a dark mask of humiliation. He didn't strike again, not with his hands. He sneered, spitting on the floorboards right at the rancher's feet. "Let's see how long you can guard a ghost," he snarled, and then he melted back into the crowd. She was trembling, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But the rancher didn't falter. He guided her gently toward a chair at the edge of the room, his hand on her back firm but careful, as though he truly believed she might shatter. The saloon wasn't laughing anymore. It was buzzing. Whispers snapped through the air like whips. Mockery, doubt, and something else. Something she had never heard directed her way before. A tiny, grudging trace of respect. She clutched the shawl tighter, knowing this was only the beginning. The battle had just been drawn, and every single thread of that old fabric was now bound to him as much as it was to her. The rancher settled her into a chair near the hearth. The firelight flickered across her, catching the threads of her shawl, making every single fray and tear gleam like an old scar. She pulled it close, trying to hide in its folds, but the laughter still echoed in her ears. The whispers still felt like needles in her heart. Across the room, Vernon Hale was nursing his wrist with a mug of whiskey. His eyes were like burning coals, and they never, ever left her. The rancher stood nearby, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He was silent, but he was a mountain. His shadow was a physical wall between her and the poison that still filled the room. For the first time since she'd arrived in Dustin, She felt like she could actually breathe, but every breath tasted of smoke and fear. She leaned toward him, whispering so low that only he could hear. "That shawl was my mother's," she said, her voice cracking. "It's all I have left of her." When he grabbed for it, I thought I was going to lose the last piece of her, too. Her head was bowed in shame, but the rancher crouched down beside her. His gaze was steady, and his words were simple and clean. "Then I will not let it be torn." She blinked, startled by the certainty in his voice. Her fingers tightened on the fabric, as if his vow had somehow stitched new strength right into the seams. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks drifting toward the ceiling like tiny dying stars. But before the quiet could settle, a new wave of laughter broke out from the bar. "Look at her!" a man jeered, his voice loud and caring. "Clinging to that old rag like it's spun from gold. There ain't no woman worth less than one who hides behind scraps." The saloon erupted again. The cruel voices rose, drowning out the lonely fiddle, each man feeding off the other's scorn. Her cheeks flamed. Her heart felt like it was crumpling inside her chest. She pressed the shawl tighter, as though their words were physical things that could pierce her flesh. The rancher rose. His broad frame seemed to tower over everyone as he stepped into the middle of the floor. His voice cut through the noise like a freshly sharpened blade. "What she holds is more than cloth," he declared. "It is memory. It is dignity. And you soil yourselves by mocking it." The room stilled again, shocked by the force of his defiance. A few mutters bubbled up at the edges from men who weren't willing to give up their cruelty so easily. Hale barked a bitter laugh. His pride was still stinging. He pushed himself to his feet. "You talk like she's the Queen of Dustin, Red Fern," he sneered. "But all I see is a beggar wrapped in pity. That shawl won't protect her from the truth." He stalked closer, and the crowd instinctively pressed back, clearing a space, hungry for the next round of the spectacle. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers twisted in the fabric. But she forced herself to rise. She was trembling, but she was on her feet. Her own voice broke free. "It is truth," she whispered, but it was loud enough to carry in the sudden hush. "The truth that I have nothing else, and still I stand." The words faltered at the end, but they echoed in the quiet. More than one sneer died on a man's lips. For the first time, the crowd wasn't just looking at a shadow. They were looking at something solid. Fragile, yes, but somehow not broken. Hale's sneer deepened, his fury mounting at her unexpected defiance. "Stand all you like," he spat. "But when that rag is finally torn from your back, you'll see just how little of you is left." His threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A murmur rose like distant thunder. She sank back into her chair, her brief surge of strength gone. But the rancher placed his hand on her shoulder. It was steady, it was firm. "It will not be torn," he said, his eyes locked on Hale. "Not while I draw breath." And though the laughter tried to rise again, this time it was brittle and weak. The vow hung heavier. It seemed to weave itself into the smoky rafters, until the very timbers of the saloon carried its weight. She clutched the shawl, her heart trembling. She knew that every thread now carried his promise as well as her own memory. And Hale was a man who lived to break promises. The night got thicker, choked with whiskey and malice. The saloon lamps cast long, dancing shadows that made monsters on the warped floorboards. The crowd pressed in tighter, just waiting for the next spark to catch fire. Hale leaned against the bar, his jaw set like granite. His pride had been gnawed raw by the rancher's words, and he was letting it fester. The men around him were only making it worse, their voices sharp with mockery, poking at his wounded ego. "Red Fern's gone soft," one of them laughed, slamming his mug down. "Protecting rags and beggars. Acts like she's actually worth something." Another one spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the floor. "I say we strip that shawl off her for good. See what she's really hiding under there." Their jeers sent a fresh ripple of laughter through the room. It was a brittle, eager sound. Her stomach twisted, each laugh feeling like a claw scraping at her skin. She pulled the shawl tighter, wishing she could just vanish into its frayed, familiar folds. The rancher stood beside her, his broad shoulders squared, his silence more powerful than any shout. His hand brushed against hers, a quiet, solid anchor in the storm. When she dared to look up at him, his gaze was steady, completely unshaken by the hate swirling around them. Finally, Hale pushed himself off the bar. He strode forward, his boots thudding hard on the planks, each step a deliberate challenge. "You think standing between her and us makes her more than what she is?" He sneered, his voice carrying over the buzz of the crowd. "Dustin don't bow to beggars, Redfern, and Dustin sure as hell don't bow to Lakota lovers who shame their own kind." Sharp, ugly gasps rippled through the saloon. That venom wasn't random. It was aimed to cut deeper than any other insult. The rancher's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping under his skin. But when he spoke, his voice was low and steady as iron. "Respect does not bow," he said simply. "It stands." Hale laughed, a cruel, sharp bark of a sound. He began to circle them, as if the saloon was an arena he had built just for this moment. "Respect?" he barked. "Then let her stand on her own. Let's strip away that rag she clings to, and we'll all see what little is left." His hand shot forward, fast and vicious. He was grasping for the shawl again. She jerked back with a cry, stumbling against the table behind her. "Don't touch me!" The words rang out, trembling but fierce. For an instant, the saloon froze again, the echo of her voice cutting through the smoke and the sneers. The rancher stepped forward. His voice was like thunder rolling low across the plains. "You heard her." He stood between them once more. His chest was broad, his fists were clenched, and the sheer weight of his presence seemed to blot out Hale's smirk. Hale's lips curled, his pride inflamed beyond reason. "Hide behind him if you want," he spat at her. "But sooner or later he won't be there. And when he's gone, you'll be nothing but rags again." The crowd murmured, some with cruel delight, others with an uneasy silence. Their faces, lit by the flickering lamplight, were a sea of hungry eyes waiting for the clash. She trembled, clutching the shawl, her breath shallow and tight in her chest. But when she looked at the solid, immovable wall of the rancher's back, a tiny spark of steadiness flickered inside her. He turned his head just enough for his words to reach her, and her alone. "Hold tight," he said. "You're not alone." Then his gaze swung back to Hale, his stance rooted to the floor, his eyes dark with a promise of pain. The air between the two men grew thick, charged with violence. The entire room held its breath. Somewhere in the back, a mug shattered against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot. The saloon erupted in jeers once more. They were demanding a spectacle. They were demanding her shame. Hale spread his arms wide, a mocking invitation. "Let's see if your vow hold," he shouted, "when that pretty shawl is lying in the dirt." His words hung in the air, heavy as a tombstone, and she knew in her bones that the moment of tearing was coming. The shawl quivered in her hands, as fragile as a spider's web, but her heart clung to the vow that was now wrapped tight in its folds. The vow that he would not let it fall without standing beside her. The saloon was a cauldron boiling over. Every laugh was sharp as broken glass, every whisper cut deep. Hale's pride had swollen past all restraint. He strode forward with the swagger of a man who was absolutely certain the crowd would cheer for his cruelty. She backed away, pressing herself against a rough wooden table. She clutched the shawl so close it felt like it was stitched to her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps as Hale's shadow fell over her. "Let's show Dustin what pity really hide," he sneered, and his hand lashed out. She jerked away, her voice breaking in a desperate cry. "Don't touch me!" But this time he was too fast. His fingers closed on the shawl. He yanked, hard. The fabric ripped. The sound silenced everything. It was a harsh, tearing sound that echoed through the smoky air like a rifle shot. Gasps broke the stillness. Then the saloon erupted, not just in mockery anymore, in shock. Men stamped their boots. Women covered their mouths, their eyes wide with a sort of feigned, horrified pity. The torn piece of the shawl dangled from Hale's fist. The frayed threads fluttered like a tattered flag of victory. He held it high, his grin stretched in triumph. "See?" he shouted to the crowd. "A rag, nothing more. This is what Red Fern fights for. A beggar's scrap." She just stood there, frozen. Her arms felt bare and cold. Her cheeks were on fire. The weight of her shame was a physical thing, threatening to crush her to the floor. Every eye in that room drank in her humiliation. Her vision blurred with tears as the crowd's laughter rose around her like a storm. For a terrible moment, she wished the floorboards would just split open and swallow her whole. Then a new sound cracked through the noise. Thud. It was sharp and sudden. The rancher had slammed his fist down on the bar. The mugs rattled, the bottles jumped, and the laughter faltered. He stepped forward. His stride was unhurried. His face was carved from stone. The very air seemed to bend around him, as if even the smoke didn't dare to touch him. He didn't say a word. He just closed the distance between himself and Hale. His eyes were locked on the other man, and Hale, for the very first time, seemed to hesitate. The rancher's shadow completely swallowed his triumphant grin. "You tear cloth," the rancher said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Because you cannot tear truth." He snatched the torn piece of shawl from Hale's grip. He did it with such force that Hale staggered backward, his smirk finally broken, his wrist stinging from the raw strength in that hand. The crowd was hushed, waiting. The rancher turned, the ragged fabric hanging from his grasp. He knelt before her. His voice was softer now, the heat in it a steady flame against the storm. "It is torn," he said, placing it gently back into her trembling hands. "But so are we all. It still warms, and it still belongs to you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and fast. She clutched the shredded fabric, her shame now mixed with the unbelievable weight of his vow. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers collided in the smoky air. Some men sneered, mocking his tenderness. But others just stared in an uneasy awe, as if they were seeing a kind of strength they had never known or understood. Hale's face darkened, fury replacing his fleeting triumph. "This ain't over," he snarled, his voice cracking with rage and humiliation. "You'll bleed for shaming me in front of them all." He stormed back through the crowd, his men trailing behind him like dogs at their master's heel. The saloon roared again, but it wasn't with laughter. It was with the buzz of fear, of wonder, of a town suddenly torn between its love of cruelty and its grudging respect for a man who would not bend. She clutched the shawl, its threads broken, but its warmth somehow still intact. And though her body trembled, her heart felt the first flicker of something fierce, dignity rising from the tatters. But she knew. Hale's threat was still hanging heavy in the rafters, and the next time he struck, it would not be cloth he aimed to tear. After Hale stormed out, the noise in the saloon slowly bled away. The fiddle stayed silent. Mugs were left on tables half full. The smoke seemed to hang heavier, thick with unease. She sat by the hearth again, the torn shawl clutched in her lap. Its frayed edges whispered of a humiliation she couldn't seem to shake. Every eye in the room still lingered on her. Some were still sharp with mockery, others were just restless, replaying the tearing in their minds. Her cheeks burned, her chest rose and fell as if she had run for miles. But she couldn't leave. Her legs wouldn't obey, and the world outside promised only more of the same. More jeers, more stares. The rancher stood before her, his hands braced on the back of a chair. His gaze was fixed on the swinging doors through which Hale had vanished. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. There was a storm brewing under his silence. At last he turned, his voice low but steady, cutting through the thick air. "He will come again." She flinched. The certainty in his words was terrifying. Her fingers twisted in the shawl until the threads dug painfully into her skin. "I can't bear it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every time they rip at it, I feel like I'm nothing all over again." The rancher crouched beside her, his eyes now level with hers. The firelight caught the steel in his gaze. "You are not nothing," he said. Each word was deliberate, heavy with meaning. "They laugh because they fear what they cannot break. The shawl is cloth. You are more." Her tears spilled over, falling hot onto the torn fabric. "It was my mother's, the last piece of her I had, and now it's ruined." He reached out. His calloused fingers brushed the frayed edge with a gentleness that startled her. "Ruined?" he asked softly. "No. Torn, yes. But torn is not the same as broken. It still carries her warmth. And now," he paused, "it carries mine too." His words wrapped around her like the shawl once had, solid and comforting. For a single heartbeat, she let herself believe him. But the whispers started again from the remaining crowd. Cruel voices that refused to die. She'll drag him down with her pity, one man muttered into his mug. Red Fern's throwing his name in the mud for nothing, another scoffed. The rancher rose to his full height. His shadow fell across them all. His voice rang through the rafters. Let them speak, he declared. I will not bend. His declaration split the room. Some men shifted in their seats, a flicker of shame in their eyes. Others just sneered deeper, unwilling to let go of their spite. She stared up at him, her breath caught in her chest. She pressed the torn shawl closer, as if his words had somehow stitched strength back into its phrase. For the first time, she felt the crowd's noise begin to dim in her heart, drowned out by the sheer, unwavering weight of his vow. Outside, she could hear the crunch of boots in the snow. Hale's men were lingering out there. Their laughter carried through the cold night air, and every sound was a promise of vengeance. She trembled, fear a cold knot in her stomach. But then the rancher's hand found hers. It was firm, unyielding. They will try again, he said, his voice like iron. And when they do, I will stand before you as many times as it takes. She clutched his hand, the torn shawl pressed between their palms. And though her tears still fell, they no longer tasted only of shame. They tasted of something new. Resolve. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. For the first time since the tearing, she didn't feel ruined. She felt remade. But she knew the storm wasn't over. Hale's pride had been split open in front of the whole saloon, and men like him did not lick their wounds in silence. When he returned, he would not come for cloth. He would come for blood. The days that followed were heavy and slow, each hour weighted down with whispers. The story of what happened in the saloon spread through the streets of Dustin like wildfire. How the rancher, Red Fern, had stood against the whole room. How Vernon Hale's pride had been ripped as raw as the shawl he tore. Some people laughed, calling Red Fern a fool. Others murmured that maybe the rancher's quiet strength had shown them a kind of truth they'd all forgotten. But no matter where she went, eyes followed her. Mocking or curious, never kind. She kept the torn shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Every fray was a reminder of her shame, but it was also a reminder of the vow that was now stitched into its tatters by the man who had given it back to her. The rancher stayed close, quiet and watchful. His hand always seemed to be near hers. His gaze was constantly scanning every corner, every shadow, as if he expected danger to spill out at any moment. That danger came sooner than either of them hoped. It was the third night. The saloon lamps glowed like angry embers across the street, and the sound of laughter spilled out into the snow-hushed dark. She was standing by the window of the small cabin he'd given her, clutching the shawl, when the sound of boots hit the porch hard. The door rattled under a pounding fist. A voice snarled through the wood. Red Fern, you think you shamed me. You think Dustin is going to bow to your pity? Come out and face me like a man. It was Hale. His words were thick with rage, and he wasn't alone. His pride had dragged half a dozen other men with him. Their laughter was hard and cruel in the cold night. The rancher set down his cup of coffee. His face was calm, but a storm was gathering in his dark eyes. He rose, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and pulled open the door. There stood Hale, his hat pulled low, his eyes burning with hate. His men were fanned out behind him, holding torches. Their jeers were a chorus of pure spite. Bring her out, Hale spat, pointing a finger toward the shadows where she stood clutching her shawl. Let the town see what kind of trash you're hiding. Or are you afraid they'll finally know she ain't worth your name? She trembled, pressing the shawl so tight it was a wonder it didn't disintegrate. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, his big frame completely filling the doorway. His voice was steady. She's not yours to touch, Hale. She never was. Hale's grin curled like the edge of a knife. Not mine, not anyone's. That's the truth of her, Red Fern. Unwanted. You can't change that by playing her guard dog. The rancher's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. She is wanted, he said. the words clear and sharp in the frosty air. She is chosen, and you'll choke on that truth before I let you lay a hand on her again. The men behind Hale roared with laughter. One of them spit a long stream of tobacco juice into the clean snow. Big words, one of them mocked. Let's see if he bleeds as proud as he speaks. The rancher took a step forward, his boots crunching on the frost. His voice dropped low enough to cut right through their jeers. Try. The word hung in the night like a drawn pistol. Hale's grin faltered for just a second, but his wounded pride shoved him onward. He lunged, his fists swinging wild and angry. The rancher met him hard, catching the blow and shoving Hale back so forcefully that he stumbled and fell into the snow. Gasps broke from the small crowd. Their laughter was torn into confused shards. She stood frozen in the doorway, the shawl clutched to her chest, her breath coming in ragged pants. The firelight from inside the cabin spilled out across the snow, catching the torn fabric of her shawl and the pure, murderous rage in Hale's eyes. He scrambled up, spitting blood. His voice was a snarl. This ends in the square, he seethed. In front of all of Dustin, I'll tear your precious vow apart where everyone can see. He turned and stormed away, his men practically dragging him into the darkness, their torches bobbing like angry fireflies. The rancher watched them vanish, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. But when he turned back to her, his eyes carried the heavy truth of it all. The storm was finally coming, and this time, the whole town would be the witness. By dawn, the entire town of Dustin was buzzing. The news of Hale's challenge had spread from every doorway and hitching post like smoke from a wildfire. The saloon talk had spilled over to the mercantile, the blacksmith's forge, even the quiet churchyard. Redfern had defied Vernon Hale, and now the town square would decide who held the truth. She heard it all from the shadows of the cabin. The torn shawl was wrapped tight around her shoulders, and every whispered word from the street felt like a new cut. He's ruined, one woman hissed to another as they passed by. No man stands against Hale and walks away. Another voice muttered, he's a fool, throwing his name and his life away on her. The words stung, sharp and deep, but the rancher just moved about his morning chores, as steady as always. His silence was like stone. It wasn't until the sky began to blush with the colors of dusk that he finally came inside. He wiped the frost from his beard and his eyes found hers where she sat huddled by the fire. It will be tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened on the shawl. What will he do? He crouched down in front of her, his gaze level, his hand resting gently over hers on the arm of the chair. What he always does, he said. Try to break what he can't understand. His voice softened. But you will not break. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I already have. They all saw it. His thumb brushed over the frayed threads of her shawl. They saw cloth torn, he said quietly. They did not see you fall. Tonight, they will. The words sank into her, deep and steady. They calmed her breathing, even as the fear coiled tight and cold in her chest. When the town square filled, it was a sea of bodies. Lanterns swung from every post, their yellow glow casting long, dancing shadows over the crowd that swarmed like a rising tide. Families pressed close together. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders. Men leaned against wagons, their voices thick with anticipation. Hale was already there. He stood near the frozen fountain, a dark, imposing figure. His grin was wide as he cracked his knuckles, his pride swelling in his chest. The rancher entered from the far side of the square. His stride was even. His hat was tipped low. His gaze was steady. A wave of murmurs swept the crowd. Some jeered. Others whispered in doubt. A few were just quiet, curious. She followed a few steps behind him, her shawl held tight across her arms. Every step was a battle. She was shaking, but she was moving forward. Her heart pounded against her ribs, so hard she thought it might burst. The crowd gasped when they saw her. Their voices turned sharp. She dares to come, one man spat. Guess shame don't burn her enough. Hale's grin widened even more. His voice boomed over the lantern-lit square. There she is, the beggar queen herself, still clinging to her rags and her pity. Dustin, Shall we watch her crumble? A roar of laughter thundered through the square. Boots stomped. Mugs were lifted high. She faltered, trembling under the weight of so many hateful eyes. But then the rancher's hand found hers. It was firm, unshaken. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out, clear and loud. "You call her unwanted," he declared. "I call her chosen. And tonight I will prove that truth stands taller than your lies." The crowd hushed. The jeers thinned out. The night grew thick with tension. Hale sneered, stepping closer, his eyes like fire. "Then let her stand on her own," he spat, and he reached for the shawl again. She gasped, clutching it tighter, her knees going weak. But the rancher moved like lightning. His body was a wall in front of her. His voice was thunder. "She has stood alone long enough," he boomed. "Tonight, she stands behind me." The square held its breath. The lanterns flickered, and the entire town seemed poised between its ingrained cruelty and a dawning, terrible awe. And in the silence that followed, the storm of pride and fury finally threatened to break upon them all. The square erupted the moment Hale lunged. His fist swung wide, his voice a raw snarl of rage. The crowd surged backward, instinctively forming a ring, their eyes hungry for the spectacle. The rancher met him head-on. Their bodies collided with a heavy thud that seemed to rattle the very boards beneath the town fountain. Hale struck again, and again, and again. Every blow was fueled by his wounded, festering pride. But the rancher absorbed them with the steadiness of an old oak tree, his own fists answering in turn. Gasps tore from the onlookers as the fight spilled across the frozen dirt, the lantern light casting long, wild shadows that writhed like demons. She stood at the edge of the ring, clutching the shawl, her heart hammering in time with the blows. Every strike that landed on the rancher echoed deep in her own chest. "Break him!" a voice screamed from the crowd. "Make her pay for his pride!" another one shouted. The noise swelled and swelled until it seemed to shake the windows of the mercantile and send the old church bell quivering in its tower. Hale's men jeered from the sidelines, their laughter as sharp as knives. But other people were watching in silence now, a strange awe creeping into their eyes as the rancher refused to falter, refused to bend. Blow after blow rained down. His strength wasn't drawn from anger. It was drawn from his vow. At last, Hale began to stagger. Blood streaked his lip. His breath came in ragged, painful gulps. But his pride, his terrible pride, drove him forward. With a final, desperate roar, he lunged. But not at the rancher, at her. His hand was outstretched, his fingers hooked like claws, ready to rip the shawl from her shoulders one last time. The crowd gasped as one, the lanterns swaying with the sudden, shocking shift. But before Hale's fingers could even brush the fabric, the rancher struck. He drove Hale hard into the dirt. Hale sprawled flat, his hat flying off, his pride finally bleeding out into the cold soil of the square. Silence crashed down, heavy, complete. The rancher stood over him, his chest heaving, his voice thunderous in the sudden hush. "You tear cloth, but you cannot tear truth. You call her unwanted. I call her mine." His words rang against the clapboard walls of the surrounding buildings. They echoed down every dark alley until the square itself seemed to be holding its breath. Slowly he turned, his hand reaching for hers. Trembling, she stepped forward. She placed her fingers in his, the shawl still clutched tight in her other hand. He took it from her gently. He lifted it high before the entire town, its tatters glowing like fire in the lantern light. "This shawl is torn," he said, his voice steady and strong. "But it still warms. It still belongs, just as she does." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. They were uncertain, divided. Some men scoffed, unwilling to yield their scorn, but others shifted their feet, shame flickering in their eyes as if the truth in his words had finally cut through the thick smoke of their cruelty. Children stared, wide-eyed, their small hands clutching at their mother's skirts. A woman near the front wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, though she said nothing. Hale groaned in the dirt, his fury smoldering but finally broken. His men were too cowed to step forward and help him. The rancher lowered the shawl, draping it back across her shoulders. He did it with a tenderness that stilled her trembling. She lifted her chin. She met the eyes of the crowd, no longer cowering beneath their jeers. For the first time, she stood not in the shadow of shame, but in the bright, burning light of defiance and a sacred vow. The silence deepened, broken only by the hiss of the lanterns and the ragged breath of a man whose pride had been torn to rags. But in that silence, she knew it wasn't the end. Hale's hatred was still smoldering in the dirt. And before the night was over, he would surely rise again. And this time, it would not be her shawl he would seek to shred. It would be the very bond that had just been forged between them, before all of Dustin. The crowd held its breath as Hale dragged himself up from the dirt. His face was a twisted mask of rage, his pride bleeding heavier than the cut on his lip. The lanterns flickered, making the square glow like a stage, and every single eye was fixed on the man who simply refused to yield. His voice cracked, raw with fury. "This ain't finished," he rasped. "I'll tear that rag from her yet, and I'll show all of Dustin that she's nothing." He lunged one more time, wild and reckless. But the rancher met him with a single crushing blow. The sound cracked through the square like a rifle shot. Hale collapsed in the dust, unmoving, save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Silence followed, thick and absolute. It was broken only by the soft hiss of the lantern flames. The rancher stood over him, his chest rising steady, his shadow long and dark across the ground. Then he turned. His gaze fell on her, where she stood trembling at the edge of the ring, the shawl clutched to her chest. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the space between them. Every eye in Dustin followed his every step. He took the torn fabric from her hands. He held it high again, so all could see the tatters glowing like spun gold in the lamplight. "This shawl has been mocked," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "It has been torn and trampled, but it has endured, just as she has endured." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And before you all, I say this. What is torn can still be whole. What is scorned can still be chosen." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The power of his words was finally breaking through the hard shell of their sneers. Some men dropped their eyes, shame finally darkening their faces. A few women dabbed at their own tears, their mouths trembling with words they did not dare to speak. For the first time, the square did not laugh. It listened. He lowered the shawl, placing it gently across her shoulders. His hands were steady, almost reverent, as if he were crowning her in front of them all. Her breath caught in her throat. Her own tears spilled over, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of a dignity she had thought was lost forever. The crowd was completely hushed. The jeers had been smothered by the sight of her standing there, tall, her chin lifted, her tattered shawl gleaming like a royal banner. The rancher's voice softened, but it carried still. "You called her unwanted. I call her mine. And if any man here doubts it, let him stand where Hale has fallen." No one moved, not a soul. Hale groaned in the dirt, his pride shattered beyond any hope of repair. His men shifted uneasily, unwilling to lift him, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The silence deepened, and in that silence, a truth settled over the square that was heavier than stone. The jeers had lost their power. The cruelty had been broken. She raised her hand, trembling, and touched the shawl where it lay upon her shoulders. She felt the weight of it, not as shame, but as choice, as a vow, as something sacred. For the first time, she did not shrink from their eyes. She met them, steady and unbroken. The rancher turned, his hand finding hers, his grip firm. His gaze locked with hers for a long moment that seemed to still the entire night. Together they walked from the square. The crowd parted for them in silence, the lanterns flickering as if they were bowing to their passage. Behind them, Vernon Hale lay crumpled in the dirt, his reign of scorn finally undone. Ahead of them, the night stretched wide, the stars sharp and bright above the dark plains. She pressed the shawl closer, its threads frayed but strong, its warmth now carrying both her mother's memory and the unshakable vow of the man who had given it back to her. For the first time in Dustin, she did not feel like the unwanted one. She felt chosen. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Echoes of the West for more tales of courage and truth. Now let me ask you, If your dignity was torn in front of a crowd, would you cling to the shreds or would you wear them proudly as your crown?